Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the prologue of John's book, which spans the range of the first 18 verses in the first chapter in the gospel which bears his name. Now, John is the author, recognized author of 5 books in the New Testament, those being the gospel and the epistles, which bear his name, as well as the book of Revelation. So there's 3 epistles, in case you hadn't figured that out. But the gospel is the fourth of its kind, and it's also the last placed, and for a good reason, and that's because the other 3 fall into a general category of synoptic. That's their classification. The term synoptic is etymologically rooted in a Greek term for similarity of outlook. So actually 42% of what you read in the book of Matthew is original to his stuff. Mark is 7%. That's because Mark was the earliest chronologically written one. It came about in the year 65 AD. And Luke is 54% unique, but John's is 92% unique. It's a whole new perspective and teachings, and the reason is, one, John wrote it in the year 90, so all the others were before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD at least. And John wrote his from the 90s, and he also had the most intimate access. So of the 4 gospel authors, the only other one who was an apostle or a disciple was Matthew. But we read a lot more of John, not only in Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's and John's account, but that's because he was one of the 3 innermost trusted, those being his older brother Andrew and Peter, the Rock. So he had a special intimate access and exposure. He was identified, a self-reference. He refers to himself as the one whom Yahshua loved, and that's because he leaned on his breast in the 13th chapter of this book at the Last Supper, and he alone accompanied him all the way to the cross when all others forsook him. And he alone of the apostles would not be martyred. He alone died in old age and in peace, surrounded by friends, although he was, according to legend, at one point dropped into a pot of boiling water, yet miraculously survived. But now that we've discussed the who as the author, now we need to get down to the who as the biographical protagonist. That is Yahshua Messiah, the most remarkable, historically significant individual who ever lived. And John traces his origins to his pre-existence, whereas Matthew kind of begins his gospel with his genealogy from Abraham to David all the way to him. And then Mark puts his biographical protagonist right in the front lines right away. He's an action-oriented gospel from start to finish, so it only covers the 3 years in which he ministered. Luke gives an account of his birth and documents a unique experience of him as a 12-year-old. But John really goes to the beginning, and then it abruptly transitions to where Mark takes off, the beginning before the beginning, the dawn, before the dawn of time, pre-existence. So that's what we read in the first 4 verses especially. So the opening one reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim." In the beginning carries the same significance as Genesis 1:1. This is at the beginning of it all, of time as it is known, and the word that expression would translate as logos in the Greek, but it was understand the word it also refers not only to the scripture but it also in this context takes on a personification form. That is Yahshua Messiah. He is the Word who was with Elohim, and he was Elohim himself. He is one of the 3 manifestations thereof that has coexisted equally throughout before the dawn of eternity itself. He was in the beginning with Elohim. So that once more brings us back to the Genesis 1:1, the starting point of creation. So he was Elohim, and for the second time, John repeats that he was with Elohim. So he was not only Elohim himself, but he was with Elohim, the 3 members of Elohim being Yahweh the Father, Yahshua the Son, and the Ruach Kadesh, or the Spirit. All came to be through him, and without him, not even one came to be that came to be. So his impact on history was actually without his hand, his creative hand, the human history as we know it could not cease to exist. And then he entered into human affairs. We read, pitched his tent among men and became flesh and walked among us. But he is the reason that anyone was even there to begin with. He created all life. So in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Now life, he not only originates life as our creator, but also gives us life eternal and abundant on earth. And the light is one of his titles and personifications. We read John records him referring to himself as the light of the world in chapter 8, verse 12, and chapter 9, verse 5. So he is the light, and the contrast is established for the next verse between the contrast of light and darkness. And we're going to describe what they mean metaphorically in this context as we comment on it. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So the two first forces are light, which is synonymous and emblematic of divinity and purity and truth, whereas darkness is of sin, Satan, and lies and ignorance and just an ugly territory. But no amount of darkness can overcome the light, because by the laws of physics and the law of cosmology and the law of divinity, the light is a superior force which can bring light. It's amazing how much a flicker of light can really resonate across the vast stretches of the universe. So we are able to see stars trillions of years before they existed. At least that's what astrophysics tell us. There was a man from Elohim whose name was John. This is not John the author, but John the Baptist, the biological first cousin of the Messiah, whose mother Elizabeth was elderly than her cousin or sister Mary, and she was past the childbearing age, and we can read of this in Luke's first chapter, when Zechariah the father was visited by the angel Gabriel, frankly telling him that his wife would give birth to something Israel hadn't seen in at least 400 years, that being a prophet. And then Mary is visited by the same angel telling her that she is going to conceive and give birth to someone no one has ever seen anything like, the Messiah, who combined divinity and humanity and assumed the flesh and walked the earth among men to show us the full and final and most supreme form of revelation of who Yahweh is and what he can do. He was not... This one came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all might believe through him. So the most appropriate scriptural reference point, I feel, for marking the destiny of the one who came can be dated a little over 800 years before his birth or ministry. These words belong to Isaiah, the 40th chapter, the 3rd through 5th verse. He's to be the herald who makes way for the king to come. So his existence, his ministry was not to be the light, although many mistakenly thought he is. We're not going to have enough time to get into the section in this chapter where the Pharisees or the religious rulers interrogate him as to his identity. But John makes it plain here and elsewhere in the chapter that his mission and purpose was to point to the light and lead the way to those who could lead them to life eternal. He was the true light, which enlightens every man, coming into the world. Now the he's speaking about is clearly in reference to Yahshua, being the true light. That's a capital L before light. So he is the true light. He's the light of the world, which brings enlightenment and illumination to every man, because he came into the world to illuminate and radiate and reflect revelatory information pertaining to divinity in flesh. So that's what he was, and that's what he did. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, and the world knew him not. So this is the whole tragedy of his mortal existence. He who was eternal, was in the beginning with the Word, was Elohim, was with Elohim, etc., who brought the world into being, all life and light, through his hand. When he came into the world in human form, in the form of a human, uniting divinity and humanity in order to bridge divinity and humanity. The world rejected him, his own people, as we read in the next verse, the Jewish people, whose entire reason for existence and purpose in history was to be the blessing through all the world, the seed through whom of Abraham, through whom all the world may be blessed. And they had the scriptures, they had all the information they needed to know that he was who he said he was. Sadly, their hatred and prejudice prevented them from accepting who he was and who he claimed to be. So the Jews are actually still looking for the yet to come Messiah. He came into his own, and his own did not receive him. Those would have been the Jewish people, the chosen and special people of Yahweh, through whom he had entered into a covenantal relationship, while the nations around them were lost and estranged from the knowledge of true theology and true divinity and true worship. But they had all these spiritual advantages, yet they were enslaved by them. Legalism was prevalent around the ministerial norm around the time Yahshua came to minister among men. But as many received him, to them he gave authority to become children of Elohim, to those believing in his name. So the prize and the treasure which he offers us unworthy creatures is to be elevated into adoption in the heavenly family, and the passport to that privilege and pleasure is simple. It's merely believing in his name. Name in this context represents the character and authority, so the name is connected to the authority, as we read in the order on which the words are presented in the verse. But as many as received him, that means any and all who come in this way. The invitation is universal. Sadly, the way is straight and narrow, and broad is the path of darkness, and many who hear the calling and start the journey deviate to the broad path to death and destruction, which leads them unto hell. Who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of Elohim. There's actually a lot to digest in this rather short verse. The born not of blood refers to the born-again discourse, of which he elaborates most extensively on in the 3rd chapter of this book to Nicodemus, the Pharisee who sought him out. He spoke of being born again, and not through the womb, but being born of spirit. So I like to consider myself 7 years old in Christian years, because that's when I became born again. But it was not, we were all products of carnal sex and the flesh, but to be born again is to be born not of one's own desire, because our own desires we eliminate in the semi-suicidal experience, which amounts to a death to self, that the born-again experience entails. So it's in the will of the Father that we be born of the Spirit, and not necessarily according to our own. His election of us antedates a selection of him. And the Word became flesh, and pitched his tent among us, and we saw his esteem of as an only begotten of a Father, full in grace and truth. So there's a lot to digest here. This was, first off, a scandalous statement to the Greek audience, whose conception of the Logos, or divinity, remember the word translates as has divine implications and entailments. So the idea that divinity could somehow condescend and become humanity while retaining their separate distinction and all that stuff was scandalous to the Greeks, whose conception of divinity in heaven was transcendent beyond what the ordinary civilization perspective was. But he is the only begotten of the Father, so throughout this gospel we hear him speak to my Father in a personal sense, where it is inappropriate for us, we speak to him as our Father. He was his son in a literal sense. He was not begotten of him in the carnal sense. He had always existed with him, but he is designated a son because he was in a functionally subordinate station in the hierarchy of the divine triune. But the grace and truth is going to come with, he's going to build on that thought by comparing the law of Moses and the covenant and dispensation of him through the new dispensation, which was arrived in this personal form in the 17th verse. But John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he comes after me, has come before me, because he was before me." So John the Baptist, actually, the way that John the author records it, elaborates on his the message of pre-existence, which he opens this prologue with. So that John saying, he was born 6 months in advance of him. He was his biological cousin, and his ministry began 6 months before his ministry. Both of them began their public ministries at the age of 30 years old. That was the standard and as outlined and prescribed by the Mosaic law in Numbers 4:3 for Levitical priesthoods. They honored that. They were practicing Jews. But John is aware of the fact that he was pre-existence. He become before me. So he existed before he did in the heavens. He's eternally alive, and he was before me. So his existence, his life, actually antedates John's merely earthly life, because he's always lived in the heavens, eternally alive. "And out of his fullness we all received, and grace upon grace." Grace is the name of the new dispensation, which began after the cross, thus displacing the fifth dispensation of the law of Moses. So there's been 7 dispensations. The term dispensation pertains to the way in which divinity chooses to relate to humanity. So the first dispensation was innocence. Adam and Eve were created innocent, then they fell. That precipitated the next dispensation of conscience, whereby by partaking of the forbidden fruit, they developed the conscience to know right from wrong. And then in the third dispensation is of government, which arose not long after the flood, when humanity's ineradicably evil nature, which resulted in their being almost completely eliminated, with the exception of Noah and his family, necessitated the presence of government and force to restrain the ordinary person from their wildest impulses. Then the fourth dispensation was the dispensation of promise, marked in Genesis 4, and then from there to the end of the Old Testament, it's just one kind of long dispensation of the law, or at least in Exodus 20 to Malachi 4, it becomes about the law. But by the dawn of the New Testament, they are in the dispensation of grace. Well, he hadn't yet fulfilled the law. He came to fulfill the law, and so fulfilling it on the cross, that's when the dispensation of grace or church truly began. That is the dispensation we find ourselves now in, and what awaits us is the millennial dispensation, when the Messiah returns with sword in hand to eternally eliminate his evil in the form of his enemies, to set up a righteous rule. The control of the earth will return to its rightful owner, and this is only fitting because he created the world and the world knew him not, as we read in the 10th verse. "For the law was given through Moses, the grace and the truth came through Yahshua Messiah." This ought not be interpreted to suggest that grace was absent in the Old Covenant. We read of it as early as Genesis 6:8 or thereabout, where we read that Noah had found grace in the sight of the Father, and the truth was embedded in the law. The law was a true reflection of Yahweh's will and character and nature. But grace and truth take on new meaning. They take personifiable form, much as he did with the Word in verse 1. He personified grace and truth. They took on new meaning and new definition in his full manifestation thereof, which he embodied. And the final verse we're going to close with today is verse 18. "No one has ever seen Yahweh, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father," he declared. So this isn't the most grammatically polished presentation of the words that are and concepts which are expressed in this but he's trying to say that no one ever saw Yahweh. Yahweh is an invisible being with invisible properties, non-material in composition, so it is impossible to see him. But in an act of supreme form of grace, he sent his Son to become Word through the flesh, through the human birth, which the Ruach Kodesh initiated. And he is in the bosom of the Father, and as such, in being so sent to men, he exists as the full, final, and complete revelation of divinity. The author of Hebrews declares as much in the first 3 verses of that book, but that's in fact nothing new at this point, because in the Gospel of John it's established early here. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.